Hello, everyone. We are very happy to have you with us tonight. I would like to welcome our exceptional panelists, as well as our numerous participants, which are connecting from all over the world. This webinar is co-organized between Aldic and Le Commerce du Levant. Aldic is the Lebanese Association for Taxpayers' Rights. It aims at promoting tax ethics and compliance by informing citizens about their rights and obligations and about issues and challenges of taxation. Aldic is also a platform for dialogue, cooperation, and exchange to serve public interest. It has lately been very active in several areas of public interest, such as the banking sector's current situation, the economic rescue plan, the fight against corruption, and so many others, all of which are subjects which will be discussed tonight in this webinar entitled Towards Sustainable Development. I will let Mr. Sami Atalla, our moderator tonight, introduce our subject and our guests. But before that, a quick introduction about Mr. Atalla. Sami Atalla is the director of the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies. He is currently leading several policy studies and has edited several books already. Sami has also been involved in drafting the decentralization law. He holds a PhD in politics from New York University and has 2 master's degrees. Sami, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Karine, so much. And thank you for Aldic and Le Commerce du Levant for organizing a very important and timely panel, which is towards sustainable development, options for Lebanon beyond the financial crisis. Why do I think this is a very important panel? Because Lebanon is facing an unprecedented crisis. We all know, and we're all living it every day, the Lebanese pound has lost more than 80% of its value. Inflation is very high. Business closure and high unemployment are all over the place. I think according to the World Bank, the economy will be shrinking by 20% this year, which is huge. And there's a lot of talk, or has been a lot of talk in the last 12 months about what Lebanon should do. And some of the panelists today, who I'm going to be introducing shortly, have been discussing these and have actually put forward some measures and policy measures on how to deal with them. But yet, I think what hasn't been recognized fully in the public realm, that Lebanon's economic model is actually dead. Simply the way the economy is actually set up to work since the early 90s, where we've been importing so much goods, exporting very little, is over. Ability to attract funds, you know what I mean, has actually dwindled almost to nil. Our successive governments have been spending so much money and collecting relatively little revenue. So we went into this cycle of borrowing and borrowing, which ended up with a huge and chronic deficit on one hand and a very high debt. All of this has actually ended in the last 12 months ago, or I would probably say 14 months ago, when the actual exchange rate was unpegged. Now, there's so much energy thinking about this, you know, regionally, we have many changes. And this is very important because how do we think of Lebanon and Lebanon's economy in the context of the changes in the region? We have a relatively decline of oil prices, which is very important source for the Lebanese economy directly and indirectly. Our geopolitical rents, or ability to accrue rents because of geopolitical reasons, has actually also been affected. And what's happening in the region more recently, the normalization between Israel and some Gulf countries, and what's the role of Lebanon on all of this. So this is really, really serious things happening both domestically and at the regional level, as well as in fact, and globally, which I'm going to be shedding light on. So Aldic and Commerce du Levant's panel today, and the topic that they've raised is very important because it forces us to zoom out and from the everyday dealing with the financial implosion, and think of the medium term, or what should Lebanon do? Because I think it's important to think of what do we need to move forward to or aspire to have as an economy, and what are the measures that will be taken today or should be taken today to ensure Lebanon actually ends up with a productive and healthy economy, as most people talk about, but very few people actually give details on. So apologies for a long introduction, but I thought it's just important to put things into context here. I'm very happy to be moderating this session with three excellent panelists. I'd like to introduce them briefly. I think their bios are circulated on the website. So, but let me just very quickly, first, I'm going to introduce Her Excellency Heide Marie Wiszork Zul, who is the Vice President of the Friends of the Global Fund Europe and a member of the German Council for Sustainable Development. She was also the former Minister for Economic Cooperation and Development in Germany. I'd also like to invite Ms. Alia Mbayed, who is a Chief Economist for the MENA region at an investment bank in London, as well as Professor Ishaq Diwan, who is professor at Paris Sciences et Lettres, where he also holds the chair of the economy of the Arab world. Hello, our dear panelists. Good to have you with me here. The way we're going to be running this today, I'm going to be asking questions to them for the next 55 minutes or so. And then after that, I'm going to open it for Q&A with the public. I hope you can actually write your question and I will sort of look into it, and then I'll take as many questions as possible given the time constraints, which we'll end up having around 15 to 20 minutes. Enough of this introduction. Let me move into the discussion. Heide Marie, I want to ask you from a sort of, let's look globally here and think one of the major challenges has been in the world right now is to actually raise revenue to ensure sustainable development. And this has been a challenge because many countries in the world, and it doesn't apply only to Lebanon, but this is a very serious problem in Lebanon, which we'll be talking about: taxes, tax collection, tax avoidance, illicit taxes, getting our money back, and so forth. You are a member of the FACTI panel, which is set up by the UN. Could you first explain to me and just share with us what is this FACTI panel and what is it trying to achieve? Because eventually I want to go and see how does it really affect Lebanon or help Lebanon in so many ways. Please.
Well, the FACTI panel, which have the honor of participating together with Karim Daya from your country, has been installed by the UN General Assembly President and ECOSOC President in March of this year. We've worked only, well, by video conferences so far. And the idea is, of course, to put forward financial accountability, transparency, and integrity. And that also means, for instance, to work for effective, accountable, inclusive institutions on all levels, reduce illegal financial flows, fight corruption, bribery, and ask for decisions on all levels to be inclusive and participatory and representative, and also have access to independent judiciary systems. So, and of course, one of the major topics is also to make sure that, for instance, the profit shifting, which is costing all countries in the world about 500 billion US dollars, which is lost for the Sustainable Development Goals, for instance, and also money laundering of about 1.6 billion US dollars and amounting to 2.7% of global GDP. So those are the topics. And actually, I hope that what we will decide in the panel, the report is going to come in February, will hopefully be also a possibility for you to use it in internal, but also in international discussions.
Very good, thank you. So what does the report do at the end of the day? Does it give recommendations, and how could civil society organizations, I'm just interested to see, could actually make use of such a document?
Exactly. So far, we have not, it is an interim report so far,
Mm,
which was put forward in September. The final report is going to be in February next year. And
mm,
then there are going to be formal recommendations. But I think I could already at that time say important points which will be very
mm,
helpful for you would be, on one hand, to go beyond the secrecy, which
mm,
is, just sheltering crime and fraud and
mm,
bribery. And we call for more transparency. We call for instance, for a universal register of
mm,
beneficial ownership. That is, people must know who the real owner of, a company or whatever is, so that he can be taxed, so that the judiciary system can reach him. This is one important point. And also to overcome impunity of grand corruption in which government representatives have been in, and also, uh, for instance, published tenders and contracts, all those
mm,
elements, or anti-corruption bodies. And in a
mm,
nutshell, it is actually to make the state use its possibilities and responsibilities for fulfilling its tasks for the people in education and health system,
mm,
responsibility to the people. Those are some of the points.
mm, mm. So very good, because as you may know, and I know you know Lebanon, one of the two major problems, at least that you address in the report, which is tax avoidance, tax evasion. Lebanon, in fact, compared to peer countries, actually even collects less tax.
Yeah,
In fact, even policymakers, one time, I was telling them that they actually prefer to borrow than to tax. Very interesting, or even exert more effort to tax,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And the response was, yeah, it's okay, but we're borrowing at 1%, as if it's justifiable. But that's another point. But what's the sort of, to me, while given the political setup here, will there be international or future norms whereby if Lebanon doesn't do this, if the Lebanese government doesn't do this, does not do some of these recommendations, what sort of pressure could come from other countries
Yeah,
that may actually support us, support the
yeah.
civil society in pushing for that?
I see this report also when discussing with Karim on the situation in your country. I see this report uh, also as a possibility to help the democratic process, which
Mm,
is going on
mm,
internally in your country, but also internationally. And there are two possibilities which could be used by you, by the international society. One thing is, next year, there is going to be the conference on the Convention Against Corruption, the UNCAC conference. And there would be a possibility actually to call on all the elements to be fulfilled in this convention, and also ask what is happening in your country. The second thing is on the Sustainable Development Goals. There is going to be the so-called high-level political forum in July, where actually every country has to show how did it reach
mm,
the Sustainable Development Goals? And that is the second possibility. And there is
mm,
also a possibility, for instance, to say, let's do a peer review,
mm,
for instance, with the Secretariat of UNCAC, of the Secretariat of the Convention Against Corruption, which might be helpful. So
mm,
that's, of course, you are
mm.
doing everything within the country. You are the responsible, but we can try to be helpful and support the ongoing democratic process.
Very good, thank you. Heidi Marie, one question, and I'd love to pick your brain on this, whether it's part of the faculty panel or not. But one thing, Lebanon's economic model, which I've and many others have declared that is actually dead, has been relying on attracting capital from abroad to become safe haven for capital from all parts of the globe. And some people here have been pushing and maintaining the bank secrecy law because they feel that without it, Lebanon will lose its comparative advantage and what have you. Now, with all these changes happening in the world and this whole international cooperation and the norms whereby there is a push for transparency, and disclosure. What do you say about that? I mean, shouldn't Lebanon be calling this off and come out, with and bury this bank secrecy law and move on to the full transparency, or there's still room for countries to still remain in the gray zone as we are now and still hope to attract capital?
No, definitely. I mean, this is a race to the bottom, and we must prevent that. And all the other countries should also be in favor of being transparent in this field. I draw a conclusion which perhaps is difficult, but in climate questions, we all agree that it is not of course, it's the individual decisions of a country, but you have a joint aim. You have a joint goal. And we should use a universal access via the UN in this field in order to abolish these gray zones.
Very good, very good. Thank you so much. I'll be back with more questions. Now I want to move to, in parallel to all this financial stuff that we're talking about, Ishaq, I'd love to get your take on the changes in the world, particularly the whole debate and the transformation in terms of the globalization scene. What does it really mean for Lebanon as a small country? We've been talking a lot that Lebanon needs to become a productive economy, but I see very few people actually telling us how they're going to do so, how we're going to be moving away from exporting people to exporting goods, So how do you see all of this changing or the changes in the globalization affecting Lebanon, and what could Lebanon do about this, again, in the medium term? Go ahead.
Well, first, hi Sam. Hello, hi Marie and Alia. Very, very good to be on a panel with you. And I see we have 212 participants. So the talking about the future of Lebanon, thinking about the long term seems is not crazy. You're absolutely right. If I may just start with a small remark about why this is not crazy. Of course, we have big problems in the short term, but it's hard to solve those problems if there is no vision about the future, where it's going. And it's because the old model is dead that future is so important. And one more reason why it's dead is exactly what Heidi Marie was talking about. Capital flows are becoming much more regulated, and it certainly is not going to pay to be a tax haven in the future. So Lebanon has to think about what it can become. And I think that conversation is useful for the political change. I mean, nothing will happen without good political change. But political change will not happen also if there is not a hopeful vision for the future. Because politicians will fight over the cake if they don't see a vision for cooperating and making that cake bigger. And the second reason is that the very important reforms that we have to do just for the recovery and the stabilization also have to be guided by that vision for the future. And I know the conversation will come to that. So to answer your question, perhaps, the big question is what is this model? And I mean, clearly Lebanon being a small country and having to live in the future not on capital flows, but on productivity, exports are going to be central. The market is too small to sustain growth. So we have to think about exports. And the question becomes what type of exports? Now, the good news is that even though exports have been coming down in Lebanon because of the overvalued exchange rate, Lebanon still exports many products to many regions, as is very well shown in a working paper from LCPS. I noted nearly 1,200 products and 171 countries to which export goes, various small niches, but very diversified over the product space.
Sure.
So this means many things are possible. And there are choices in terms of where to move into the future. Now, when I look at where the world is going, I mean, first, you may think it's not that important because Lebanon is small after all. I mean, I did the small back of the envelope calculation, and our GDP per capita was at about $8,000 in 2019 before it plunged. It's probably going to fall by, unfortunately, maybe half. So to come back to the same level of GDP per capita, there is probably a need to increase export by something like $10 billion. Maybe that's a number we can focus on, which is multiplying what we have now, $3.5 billion by 4. And there are many ways of doing that, but still this is small relative to the global market. So, we could fit manufactured goods, services, different things, and there are choices there. And certainly manufactured goods, the various niches Lebanon is in, can easily double. But it'd be important to go into the niches with high value added. It's the way the world is going though, with globalization and robotization. This is a phenomena that Richard Baldwin has called the globalization of the world. Globalization and robotization is such that the fastest growing product in international trade right now is high-tech tradable services. And this is an area where Lebanon has many comparative advantages. And it is an area which, if combined with niche manufacturing export, can give rise to the type of growth that we could discuss that is more inclusive and really plays to Lebanon comparative advantages. Innovation, entrepreneurship, culture, global networks, and education, very important. So if I have to conclude, I would say a Costa Rica model, build on new technologies and green growth, together with some aspect of Dubai, which is services, but specifically high-tech tradable services. So instead of exporting people, we have firms in the country that bring skills together to export services through the internet, really. So migration now becomes tele-migration rather than real migration. This is the way the world is going. And I think Lebanon could really be, in our vision, a base for such high-tech services.
Ishaq, let me just push this when you talk about this is really good and I think valuable to think about, and particularly to sort of aim for. So when you're thinking of both the services and high tech, what do you have in mind? You know what I mean? Let's just give our audience some sort of tangible ideas of what this could be. And then my follow-up question to that, what are the necessary prerequisites for that? Because you mentioned, I mean, there's some investment climate to that, but there's also the education part, which you very well highlighted. And how do we make sure that we don't cater for the skilled and what happens to the unskilled? Because this whole issue here where we have, a lot of the skilled labor leaving, emigrating, or at least we're not able to maintain that or maintain them here, especially in today's financial crisis.
Well, you probably have heard of Murex, which is a software company that designs software for the financial sector. It was born in Lebanon. It's now a multinational. What I'm talking about, I mean, if you want to create $5 billion of exports in high-tech services, it would be having 10 Murexes in Lebanon, basically. That's the scope of what we're talking about. Now, this bundle, this portfolio can include things like software design, especially in Arabic software for the Arab market. We need to talk about the regional market, but this is where the Lebanese would have a comparative advantage. It's health, telemedicine, It's education, distance education, university management, it's consulting firms, engineering, and architecture, it's cultural production, it's advertising, design, media, music, publishing, movies, and we actually have already firms that could grow into national champions, regional champions in all of this. I mean, think of top hospitals, top universities, Dar al Handasa, Booz Lebanon, Murex, LBC, Saatchi Lebanon. I mean, there are all kinds of firms and new firms that could be the champions of this expansion. So this is on your first question. You want me to jump to the second?
Please do. Yes.
I mean, clearly this model by itself only focusing on high skills would be unequalizing. And so we have to think of sustainability here. And there are many dimensions to sustainability, but I'd say, in my mind, this is not the model for another Dubai. You know, Dubai has 500,000 nationals and 3 million expats, of which a whole bunch of very highly paid, high skills. But to be crude, you know, Dubai is a real estate project. We're talking of a national project. And so a national project has to be sustainable socially and environmentally and make sense. I think it's very important to of course, educate. I mean, I'll come back to the sustainability of the model later, but let me first focus on the inclusive aspects of the sustainability. I think, unlike the past, around this kind of productive sector, there will be service non-tradable sectors, and it's going to be important to reserve this sector for people with medium-level skills. So the education sector has to educate people. We can't expect them all to become engineers, but they should have a place in a protected, non-tradable sector that is equipped with machine and has a relatively high productivity and high wages. That means that, unlike the past, we will have to be much more restrictive in terms of migration of low skills into Lebanon. And like Dubai, that will remain perhaps a comparative advantage of Dubai for a while, to have very cheap maids, to put it very crudely. But already Saudi Arabia is realizing that to create medium skills jobs for national, it has to be in the tradable sectors, in things like transport, cleaning, childcare, construction, where the productivity is raised, the market is protected. So we don't have very cheap labor that prevent the market from becoming more productive. And that will ensure, and I think that's the only way to ensure inclusive growth, because inclusive growth is not about redistribution only. It's about having good jobs for everyone.
Very good. Very good. Thanks, Ashad, for shedding light on this. And speaking of the region, this is what I want to go with Alia and talk about where is the region going? What are the trends happening in the region in light of the oil prices? Lebanon has depended on the region for its both in terms of finance and in terms of exports. So my first question to you, Alia, is can you just shed light on the trends here? So we know and get a feel of what Lebanon could or should be fitting in the future. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Sami, and thank you, Aldic and Commerce du Levant, for inviting me to share the panel with distinguished guests and friends. I mean, obviously, just as a prelude on the importance of this panel, and a year ago, for many who are listening to us, we were part of a discussion on how to build a roadmap out of the unfolding crisis, and we did put it forward. And at that time, I think when we all were together, we never thought that 1 year later we would be coming together to still find ourselves in a not necessarily the same situation, but in a worse situation. But I'm saying this just to underscore of how important it is now not to continue to dwell on what we know and really sort of look forward into the necessary direction that we need to outline for us not only to reinvent ourselves, but also to provide hope. Because for those of us who are in Lebanon, I think over the last period, I think this lack of direction, in addition to all the political noise, lack of competence, the infighting on the political level, has really provided a discussion about the direction. And the direction in it, we cannot escape by thinking about how the regional and the global strategic context in which we are is evolving. And we know that the region, as you mentioned, Sami, is undergoing a structural transformation itself because of a global changing landscape, both in terms of the global economy, but mainly also about structural changes in the oil and gas sector and the agenda for climate change, which imposes imperatives for accelerated reforms in the region. And if you would like to focus, because the region is diversified, you've asked about the GCC countries. I think that to summarize what's happening is that we are facing countries that are transforming from being historically capital exporting and labor importing countries, transforming themselves into capital importing and labor re-exporting countries. I mean,
Hello, did we lose? Hello, Alia? She's reconnecting, I think. Okay, I think we lost Alia for a second. All right, let's see if she doesn't come through. She can reconnect and we regroup on this. Oh, she's back. Alia, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. And this is very important because in the region there will be competition for capital, and Lebanon will have to compete also with these countries that are basically vouching for attracting capital now that they have become importing. The other important trend is what is happening in their labor market. The necessity to basically attend to the demographic challenges, particularly in countries like Saudi Arabia, in Oman, for example, we have the agenda for labor reform, migration policies that is fundamentally changing society, and therefore policies that would affect the countries that rely on the Gulf countries as an outlet for their skilled labor, but also for some other countries for their non-skilled labor. And this important trend in labor replacement in those countries, we will have to take it into consideration because it will have implication on remittances, but also, of course, on the type of jobs that Lebanese can still have in those markets. Another important trend is really the acceleration of structural reforms. Clearly, these countries are looking also, as we are now discussing, about reinventing their growth model, raising productivity, and a lot of productivity enhancing reforms are necessary. And those reforms, whether institutional, whether in the business environment, or even whether to go back to the fiscal, finding new sources of funding will imply a different business environment, sometimes more competitive, and that is good for the Lebanese who want to deploy capital in those countries, but also these are markets that could become more expensive to invest in because they will need to introduce fees and taxes and all sorts of things. So these structural transformation, I think, provide opportunities, but also could raise challenges in terms of their impact on labor market. But I think one last and fourth trend is really also what is happening in the aid policies of many of these countries. And this is very important for a country like Lebanon that has traditionally relied on aid flows from the Gulf countries. The generosity that was that prevailed before obviously is more constrained because we are not anymore in a world of plenty in this part of the region too. But I think also the geopolitics of aid in a lot of the Gulf countries has dramatically changed, and we have seen it change its face, particularly since the inception of the Arab Spring for over the last 10 years. So their decisions to provide aid are increasingly tied to their foreign policy priorities. And to the extent that one would like to be part of the orbit of these countries for receiving that aid, then there has to be some alignment of policies or some that needs to be taken into consideration. So these are four important trends. I mean, the competition for capital, the labor replacement, the change in the face of aid policies, but also the acceleration of reforms that could maybe, if Lebanon goes in the right direction of reform, actually could make maybe Lebanon much less expensive than those countries to position itself as a hub. And that obviously offers opportunities and challenges. The opportunities I see is maybe now the capital of Lebanese is flowing around the world, but not finding its place back to Lebanon. Maybe it will go back to look for the opportunities that the reforms that the Gulf countries are undertaking, and maybe provide jobs for Lebanese there, and continue to be a good, I would say, impact shock absorber for us for a while. But at the same time, we have the tightening labor markets there because of the nationalization policies that could see some of the Lebanese particularly return and have to come back home. But this is more in the medium to long term. I'll stop here and then we can discuss.
Alia, thank you for sort of highlighting these four trends. Here's a question. The GCC has been trying to diversify their economy, and there's also work and speculation on their ability to do so, just because it brings in the politics, in the sense that the private sector is very and highly dependent on the state. And I just want to link that challenge with what Ishaq was talking earlier about exports and what Lebanon could do in terms of moving into the export sector more aggressively. What are here the potential, in your opinion, that Lebanon could take advantage of, trying to penetrate these markets, trying to, since Lebanon has actually, despite that it has a small manufacturing base, but it's quite well diversified, and I think one can argue there is potential, particularly because of the human capital. Just linking those two in terms of Lebanon's potential advantage that has been untapped, in my opinion, and the prospects of actually trying to export to the GCC beyond, obviously, agri-food, right? I mean, what's your take on it? How do you see that, and what are the prospects for Lebanon?
Well, obviously, I think a key element is being competitive when it comes to the type of products that we're competing with in the GCC markets, and I think here there are both the competition on quality, but also on price. And I think without really undertaking the the macro type of adjustments that will make our exchange rate in Lebanon more competitive as part of our exit strategy from the current financial crisis, I think it's quite hard to see how I mean, or that has been in the past a key impediment to our ability and the ability of our product to compete. So maybe now the opportunity is there to forge a macro framework that goes in the direction of more competitive, flexible exchange rates that can benefit a greater export competitiveness in this, because the quality-wise, Lebanon is able to manufacture and export product of relatively high quality, as also we see it in terms of the statistics for penetration. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is also related to the kind of trade policy agreements and arrangements that we have with many of these countries. And I think this is where we need to look beyond sort of the traditional type of goods trade agreement, which has been at the core of our relationships with the Gulf countries, but for that matter, with any other trading partner. And really expand it to capture what Lebanon does best, as Isha also said, which is the export of services, and try to redesign a trade policy and trade arrangements that can open access for services liberalization along the four modes. I mean, I'm not going to enter it, but obviously that requires mobility of people, rights of establishment, etc., etc. But I think developing that part of services liberalization formally will be essential. And the third, and that I'll end here, is to tap into what seems to be a growing global value chain in which the Gulf countries, but also others for that matter in the region, Morocco, we are seeing where some of these countries are already plugged into these global value chains, and maybe Lebanon building on a revamped trading arrangements, rules of origin negotiations, we can find a way to establish basically linking our export to these global value chains by looking at where our competitive advantage in the process of production lie, and that could be, as I mentioned, mainly in the services sector, but also I think now that the crisis is hitting, one area where we are becoming increasingly more competitive is everything related to the outsourcing. So a lot can be done by outsourcing production of services out of Lebanon into these countries, but also more globally through the global value chains established in these countries.
Thanks, Alia. I'm going to come back to you shortly to also discuss other measures beyond the trade that you've just highlighted, but thank you so much for this. And then speaking of the region, let me move with Heidi Marie to Europe. You know what I mean? And as Alia just talked about the GCC and the trends there, I'd like to sort of get your perspective on the changes in Europe, this whole big thing about reshoring, the regionalism, the investment in green energy. You know, there's just a lot of sort of changes happening. Can you first sort of maybe tell us more about these tendencies and possibly maybe speculate what do they mean for Lebanon? And let's just stretch it a little bit, and so we're actually get out of our box here, you know, while in Lebanon, and just think of how could that benefit the country, please.
Well, I always had the feeling that, Lebanon would be a kind of bridge between the regions and specifically in the relationship to Europe. And there are, of course, let's say, two possible instruments or elements which could be helpful in the cooperation. One thing is that under its neighborhood policy, European neighborhood policy, there are negotiations. There have been negotiations with the former government, but there will be once more on the question of helping on governance question, the rule of law, on growth and jobs. And the second element is what you mentioned under the heading of, the so-called European Green Deal, which is we try in Europe to see to it that we fulfill the climate agreement of Paris, and to see to it that we decarbonize our energy system, our economic system by the year 2050. And that's not so long if one looks forward. And there are elements where I could see quite a lot of possibilities of cooperation. For instance, this Green Deal has different elements. It's the efficient use of resources, water, for instance, as one point. It's the fight against the destruction of the environment. It's the recycling question, which holds a lot of technology experience and elements. It's the decarbonization of the energy sector. It's the creation of renewable energy system. It's the energy efficiency of buildings, which normally is underestimated, but it's the question of sustainable agricultural policy, where the EU has enough to do on its own agricultural policy. And it's also one also should try to streamline environmental standards in all policies, because one must not go away from what the Sustainable Development Goals demand from all of us. I would also see a possibility of cooperation or support or better cooperation on all these questions with the local communities in your country between the European Union. Because I could imagine it is also helpful if you take the situation in the country itself. Now, it's very difficult to speculate. What would that mean? I've tried to outline some areas where one could cooperate. But I mean, one question, of course, which you have to answer yourself is the question, what scenario for growth would you expect? Some of you have outlined them. I would say avoid austerity measures, which normally in cooperation sometimes are asked. I would think it's also the question of taxation within your own country. It's the wealth tax. It's progressive taxation. It's the question trade unions. That is seen from the outside. And if I may, let's say, put it to a specific point, there will be, and you've discussed that, of course, there will be measures, financial measures needed to get the kickstart of the economy going. Now, the question is it going to be the regressive policies of the present elites or past elites, or is it to put the majority of people in the center and take up their interests? Now, my point is, it's either the one or the other, and you have to choose, of course, because which strategy you would think is important. And I think because, I mean, it has to be financed besides the question, of course, of aid and cooperation and everything.
Mhm. Thank you, Hadamari. And indeed, I mean, these are very important sort of rooms or potentials for cooperation. And I think your last point on um, what sort of growth model, whether it's going to be inclusive or not, what sort of growth scenario are we going to have, how sustainable that is, and perhaps Ishaq can take a stab at that because I know Ishaq has been obviously working on many issues related to growth. Ishaq, what's your take on that? You know, on the sustainability issue, so we can first avoid the boom and bust, but also this inclusivity, exclusivity, because we know that the economy in the last 25 years really served the very, very few people very well, and it left a lot of people behind. Please.
I must say, Haida Marie explained it beautifully, and you were talking about Europe, but it felt like we were talking about Lebanon also. To put it, maybe to try to be more concrete, imagine that Lebanon manages to make progress on economic stabilization and political progress. So, and imagine that in 5 years, exports are growing at 20% a year. The economy is really transforming. There are social transformations going along at the same time. And there are really three big sectors shaping up in the economy. There are kind of the traditional export sector growing very fast. I'm talking of food, agribusiness, jewelry, design, wine, pharmaceutical, specialized machineries, what constitute today much of the export. So that's one sector doing well. This is another sector, if you like, the new technological services. There is already, by the way, $1 billion of ICT export out of Lebanon. They are badly recorded because services are all lumped together, but that is a growth sector. So imagine that sector also starts taking off. And then there is the third traditional sector, which is now largely the informal economy, that becomes better protected, where productivity is rising, and there is some investment going on. So let's say this has been ignited by some miracle. Your question is on how to sustain that over time so that it doesn't collapse in year 6, 7, or 8, but it takes us for 20 years all the way up to a level of high income, $20,000 per capita or so. And it seems to me that there are really three key conditions that have been very badly managed in the past, at least two of which were badly managed in the past, that would be central. The first one is the social justice. That is that this non-tradable sector be a comfortable place for middle-level skilled people, for people moving socially from the Akkar, from the south, to fully participate and become middle class through hard work. And that's going to take something pretty hard on the habits of Lebanese these days, which is to rely on very cheap imported labor. And we have to get used again, like every other country in the world is now getting used to, is to actually create jobs that aggregate these menial jobs, whether it's in construction or in clean energy or in agriculture, so that those becomes actually better, more productive jobs. So I think that's condition number one. Condition number two, it seems to me, is to strengthen the education system. That has really been the comparative advantage and the defining feature of the Lebanese identity since independence, if not before. But the quality has really been falling, and you can see it in international measurements. It's falling dramatically, and it's falling in parallel with the expansion of tertiary education. More and more kids are going to universities, which is very good, but the universities that are opening at the margin are pretty low quality and very badly regulated, and in many cases, areas of corruption as well. So this sector has really to be reined in and be at the heart of, I think, the model of the future. And the third area I would pick, because the model we're talking about is really a model that focuses on people and on cities and communities as growth centers, our creative growth center. The third area I would pick on is definitely the environment. It is also the long-term goal of the climate agenda, and it's the glue of citizenship in Lebanon. I mean, it's written in the national flag. It's what binds Lebanese. It's what makes Lebanon different from Dubai. And there's really a need to move to a higher level in terms of many things, in terms of zoning, national parks, green agriculture and energy, waste disposal, I don't know, water harvesting, watershed management. All this is the stuff of the growth of the protected sectors in the future, and this is what would make the growth desirable. I mean, these days or in the past, when Lebanon grew, I would be very kind of depressed, because 2-3 years of growth means we lose several mountains to crazy construction. And there is no reason why growth and the environment have to be enemies. They could be reconciled. And a good environment is actually a driver of growth, of green growth. And this is a vision that the Europeans are going to be championing, and definitely something to jump on the bandwagon. Maybe a last word to comment on what Heidi Marie and Alia were saying in terms of future of globalization. I mean, increasingly, and especially after COVID, but also because of the difficulties with the growth of China in the current political environment, it's clear that the world is going to move to reshoring, to regionalization, as opposed to flattening the earth. And so, the Arab markets and Europe are going to be very important for Lebanon. That doesn't mean that Lebanon would not deal with East and West as traditionally it does. But those two markets are going to be super important. And Alia was talking about trade agreement. The trade agreements with both are going to be very important. And both are weak and need to be looked at much more carefully. I mean, Europe needs to rethink its relationship with the South, the southern border. It cannot just be to bribe governments in order to stop refugees and to build walls. It will have to move. Now that Eastern Europe is getting digested, I think this European policies will become more sophisticated over time with the South. And there's a lot to do, to create a large Arab markets, and certainly Lebanon could play a key role in such a market and benefit from it.
Thanks, Ashaq, and I think you've highlighted these three conditions, which I think are very important. And just quick reflection before I go for my final question, as we're running out of time, believe it or not, because I have more questions to ask you. But the education part, which I think you've highlighted, is very important. And now after COVID, this whole education, what does it really mean going to university? This is a worldwide problem, right? And how do we imagine these universities, and how do we actually think of the new generation going and getting the skills, and how should we be thinking about that? And I think here there's a very interesting case for Lebanon, because there are between sort of the online, but also there are sort of specific topics, that I know that people in academics are very well versed. I mean, just think of all the work that's been done on reconstruction, just by the sheer fact that a lot of destruction here, and that people working at the American University of Beirut or other places where actually I engage urban planners and others engage in reconstruction efforts and what have you. They've gained a lot of experience, and I think it's very useful to think of these. And also the real estate, which I think is very interesting. You mentioned how it's killing the productive sector, right? Whether in agriculture and others, just because of the quick profits. But if we move and come back to the present, right, we talked about sustainable growth, and here's the question on how do you actually initiate growth, right? And this is the biggest dilemma now, How can we think of growth to spur growth now, which is so important because to actually even give hope and energy for the people to actually stay and be involved in a vision that they think they can contribute to. given the financial implosion and given all the challenges. So I'd like maybe go to Alia here. And Alia, you've been sort of also writing on these issues, particularly on the financial problem and so forth. If I want to sort of move beyond the financial and the distribution of the costs and so forth, and in light of this discussion that we're having, in light of the regional trends, and what's happening, what would you recommend? How should Lebanon actually get growth going?
Thank you, Sami. I mean, definitely, I think that's the biggest challenge, and I think for that this is why we need a vision for the future, because I think by now we know how to more or less have technical solutions if the political will is there for the financial aspect. But I think for the growth, we need first leadership to carry any vision forward. I think if so I see a lot of questions asking, so how do we start? I think the first thing that we learn in development is that development needs good people in government to devise policies and to give credibility to the reforms. So I think whoever the Lebanese need to see in front of them, to invest, to regain confidence is critical. The captain at the driver's seat, especially that we've seen people driving us off the cliff. From here on, I think the macro stabilization is essential for growth. I think if we do not go back to the basic of what we've endlessly wrote about a macro fiscal stabilization policies, in which I agree with Heidi Marie that do not need to be to promote austerity upfront, although that will be extremely hard. But I think, and this is why I started with the people first, because if you have a credibility of those in charge, then at least you can, because we need financing to kick off the growth in the first phase, then you can engage with the international community, but also with the diaspora to try to develop a vision that they could at least help you in front loading the financing risk. Because if we would like to avoid a front-loaded adjustment in terms of fiscal, because it is getting more and more difficult, we will need to have access to a bigger pool of resources, whether official or private. I think, and as part of the macro fiscal, of course, I don't need to go into the detail. It's the debt restructuring. It's also the right basically balance of revenue and expenditure policy. And here I agree with, because the principle will need to be an equitable, socially just and job creating growth vision that we want. So our approach to taxation will need to put social justice and therefore have some form of progressivity at the heart of it. At the same time, and I think our vision of how do we resize the public sector to render it more efficient, not to thwart basically and inhibit growth enhancing ideas will be essential, whether looking at its size or whether looking at how do we want to manage public assets and exploit them. So these will have to be part of our growth strategy. Besides fiscal policy, we will need to basically also look at I think some form of industrialization policies, probably in the first phase, ones that are give priority to sectors where we have agreed that this is where the comparative advantages lies and which are sustainable, whether in the energy and green or in the innovation and digital And the fact of focusing on these basically probably sectors that have the highest dividend in terms of growth and jobs, we will need to align our fiscal policies, incentive, investments into infrastructure, because these are essential part, gear them towards these priorities as we sequence our reforms. But as part of the growth, I mean, in order to make it just enough, we will need to provide for the social sector. And here, I mean, the whole reform of the social protection schemes, but at the same time, ensuring that we protect social spending, potentially by putting a floor to social spending, will be essential. But the kind of growth that we want is the sustainable growth, one that doesn't leave people behind, particularly when we are going to ask from the Lebanese to make a lot of sacrifices.
Very good.
General ideas, obviously,
yeah, sure.
We can answer more.
Thank you, Alia. Just because this is wonderful, I think a list of things. Because we have a very literally 2 minutes left before I turn to the question, and I want to give final words to Ishaq and Haida Marie. In 1 minute, if I ask you the same question, if I tell you choose 2 key priorities for the next government to actually get growth going, I'm wondering, what would you recommend? Haida Marie, and then Ishaq. Haida Marie, we can't hear you. Can you unmute yourself, please?
Yeah, I am.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
I think one thing is, of course, also to investigate into illegally channeled finance out of the country. That is going back to the questions that we had. It's also to get the finance within the country itself. And if I could say as a last point, which does not really fit into your question, I would also love to see a possibility where, you know, the region, where Lebanon in the region would play a role, and where there could, notwithstanding all divergences which exist, a kind of, well, conference or cooperation specifically between civil society across the diverging sectors and borders.
Very good. Thank you. Ishaq?
Well, if I'm thinking of kind of the stabilization, 1-2 years, compared to a plain vanilla plan with, you know, devaluation, debt reduction, fiscal retrenchment, banking sector restructuring, I'd pick from that vision that we discussed, I would pick, if I may, 4, but very quickly, implication. First, I'd keep corporate taxation relatively low, because we need lots of new firms. We need to renew the economic environment, and so corporate taxation should stay low. Second, the bank restructuring. We really need investment banking for the future, much more than wealth management. And so we need a much smaller sector. I wouldn't worry so much about shrinking the sector a whole lot. Third, electricity, telecom, I wouldn't privatize them. We don't want private monopolies. These are at the heart of the productive system of the future. They need to be regulated for effective and cheap services, not to become cash cows for the future. And finally, burden sharing. It'd be really important to preserve social solidarity rather than protect the high wealth individuals, whether they are national or foreigners. And as Alia said, have also a safety net in place. But I think we really need to avoid the kind of lirafication strategy that are making the poor and the middle class pay for this huge crisis, and shift a big portion of that to the high wealth individuals.
Very good. Thank you so much. I'm going to move to the Q&A and see what do we have here. All right, so I'm going to take a few of them. There's this question here, particularly to Haida Marie. From your background, it says you've been involved in development cooperation over many years and have experienced many challenging situations with countries in the global south, including failing states. Do you have any suggestions or recommendations to Lebanon and the Lebanese on how to address the corruption challenges in the government sector? And then are there any opportunities to focus on specific sectors that could be pilot sectors to start and lead such a process, such as water, energy, etc.? Heide Marie, what's your take on that?
Well, I come back to the question that we started with in the FACTI panel that we are discussing. And there, I think it would be important to help create this, what I call the beneficial ownership register, in order to make public who owns which well, industry, which corporation or whatever. And I think it can be done, of course, from the inside, because I see when I look from Europe, from Germany to your country, and the movement which exists. I mean, there is this movement which exists, and one has to try to sustain it from your side, and those would be, to my opinion, specific elements to create a stable state which is responsible, to be dependent on a taxation system, and also on a wealth taxation system, which I think would be necessary. And of course, all those points that the colleagues mentioned on social protection and, well,
But
yeah.
on Heide Marie, on the corruption, so basically what you're
Yes.
saying is that you recommend is to make that data available on the ownership of these,
the corruption, I mean,
yeah.
there is this, as I said at the beginning, we have this Convention Against Corruption, the UN Convention Against Corruption. And we all should see to it that the coming conference, which monitors the progress, becomes a conference which monitors the situation in your country. That would, I think, be a major point. And also, as I said at the beginning, there could be a possibility to have a kind of peer review, making public all these elements that we have been discussing about.
Okay, very good, thanks. So everyone knows what I'm doing is looking at the Q&A, the top Q&A questions, the ones that have the most likes. So I'm being very, by the way, sort of democratic about that, and I will see how much time I have to see how many questions I can take. So the next question says, we have seen that the Lebanese mafia is so powerful and no reform is possible. We need now to protect Lebanese citizens from misery and wars. Shouldn't we ask for Lebanon to be governed under UN Governance Chapter 7? Who would like to take a stab at that? Panelists?
I think this is for Heide Marie.
I didn't want to tax her again.
It's of course a provocative question, and but as I said, we have the situation where the UN and the panel is going to propose specific elements, and those are points of reference for citizens within your country. And I believe it's, let's say, a movement from the bottom, and it should be also a support, well, from the international side. And I'm sure your people can really do it. And because you see what happens after the 4th of August, what happened there. So we should support it, and the UN should support it. You have UNESCO in where you belong to. So I think this could work by you yourselves and by the people themselves.
Very good, thank you. Okay, I'm gonna skip the next question. I'm gonna come back to it though, because it's addressed to Heide Marie and I wanna give her a break. So I'm gonna come back to it though. So there's the question after that. It says, I agree that it's important to attempt to reimagine a new economic model for Lebanon. But how can one reimagine the rise of new sectors, high tech, etc., at a time when the financial sector is going bankrupt? Who will finance these new sectors? And also, there's a need to invest in the ICT infrastructure to allow for the emergence of these new sectors. Ashaq and Alia, you have been talking about finance for a long time.
Well, if I may,
Could you
very
please?
quickly, I mean, I hate to sound as if that if we are have not focused enough on finance in this panel, that we do not put finance at the heart of the growth model, and not at all. Actually, what we have been arguing is that we need to re-regulate our financial sector. So not only resize it because it's very big, 400% of asset to GDP is way above what a country in the size of Lebanon can be. We need to restructure it in order to basically deal with the losses that will have that the debt restructuring and the current basically crisis where the contraction, etc. So there is a resizing, a restructuring, but I think also fundamentally we will need to have new principles that would make and policies that would make finance work for the whole of society, and that is not what our financial sector have been used for over the last decade, if not more, and these are linked to the broader macro reform. So finance will need to be at the heart of it, but we will need to have a smaller and better regulated. We will need, I think, to overhaul the Code of Money and Credit, some of the institutions that regulate the financial sector in Lebanon, and that, as we have been witnessing over the last few days, the debate about the governance of these institutions is very much an issue that we'll need to look at it thoroughly. So as we recapitalize the sector, we restructure it and we resize it, we will need also to re-regulate it.
Okay, Ali, a quick question as a follow-up on this. Some studies show that sectors, banking sectors, or that have fewer banks, they end up targeting or serving the bigger firms or the larger firms. What's your take on that? Because one of the things you're saying exactly that we need to help and finance sort of in a way, insinuating the smaller ones, right? What's your reaction to that? Yeah.
Well, I think, I mean, when I'm saying re-regulating, I'm not saying being too directive in regulation, but there's no doubt that as part of the growth drive, we will need to create special kind of facilities, finance facilities to the small and medium enterprise sector, which contributes and which our society and our economy is mostly composed of, and we will have to create schemes that, without creating the type of contingent liabilities that that have been created by the interest subsidy model that was established by Bedell to support such sectors. We will have to create both the financing and the regulatory framework to support funding for SMEs. I do agree. This is part of the re-regulation.
Very good. Thank you so much. There's a question here that I think Ashaq could take a stab on how to build an export economy. And the question is, without infrastructure, internet, transport, energy, efficient taxes, judiciary system, and without knowing that trust is key to economy. Ashaq, in a nutshell, 1 minute, what are the two things you would do to get the exports going?
I mean, first of all, why are we talking about all these crazy things about where we can be in 10, 20 years, given the mess the country is in? It's a relevant question. We're not naive here. We're saying it's part of the process of fixing the problems to get a feel for where you're going. So this is a weapon to fight current wars. It's not just dreaming for the future. And as an example, I can answer your question here. High tech, for example, is not very intensive in capital. On the other hand, and there's growing the global market. On the other hand, it needs the very good ICT sectors. Now, as we're talking about solving the debt crisis and the banking issue, a big debate is about the banks wanting the state assets, electricity and telecom. So an easy solution would be to say we want to preserve wealth because this money could be investments into the future. So let's give them electricity and telecom to become monopolies and cows for the future. Well, that goes exactly in the opposite direction of a growth path. A growth path where capital doesn't matter as much as infrastructure. You actually tax the rich because you don't really need their capital in the future. So that the public sector, which needs to be reorganized, have fund to invest in ICT and to fix the EDL problem. So this is a map to help us fix current problems. It's not just economic fiction exercise that one is engaging in.
Very good. Very good. Thank you. And I'm going to go for the last question, the one that I skipped, and I'm going back to it. And this is to Heidi Marie. You're talking about enhancing transparency in both the public and private sector. What do you think about the bank secrecy law? Could it stand against the forensic audit on the central bank in Lebanon? This is a question.
Perhaps I didn't understand the second half. Could you repeat it once more?
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think about the bank secrecy law? Could it stand against the forensic audit on the central bank in Lebanon?
Well, of course, I hope I don't mingle into the debate that you are having, but I mean, I've seen from the outside, I would think if one restructures bank, you should try to protect small and medium depositors over shareholders. So you should also see to it that there is a change of personnel and in this sector. So I think there has to be a definite change in this field and more transparency. Going back on the question of secrecy, I think that would be a confidence building measure also towards the people in your country and also, of course, to the outside.
Very good. Thank you so much. I really want to thank my panelists. We're out of time. This has been a wonderful session. And as I said at the beginning, I'm really happy and glad that Aldic and Le Commerce du Levant actually posed this question, because I think it's forcing all of us to actually start thinking of the future. I think we need to envisage another Lebanon, another economic model, and I think this is a very good step to do so, forcing us to put our thoughts and forcing or tapping on the inside of our panelists to share with us their thoughts. And I think we've covered many things, and I'd love to sort of continue the conversation, but I'm getting the message that I should stop. But just to recap, I think we talked a lot about obviously the changes in Lebanon. I think the internal or domestic changes and reforms. We talked about the regional dimensions in Europe and the GCC and how could Lebanon think about those. We also talked about how to spur growth and how to sustain growth. We talked about all the prerequisites of growth, what is about education, what about the infrastructure. So there's a lot of things happening here. And obviously we talked about the finance part, and we talked about the trade. I mean, I think it's been wonderful because I think we're able, thanks to you and your insight, to cover many, many grounds, and particularly the international cooperation and the future norms for Lebanon, particularly on issues related to tax evasion, illicit wealth, tax avoidance, and what have you. So once again, thank you. I want to pass the floor to Karine, who actually introduced me. And once again, thank you so much. Karine, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sami, and our esteemed panelists for enlightening us with these concrete solutions, which means hope for a sustainable Lebanon. I would also like to thank all our participants from all over the world. We really appreciate you being with us today. We would like to invite you as well to follow our social media, and as well you can consult our website www.aldic.net. And because I mean it's a very rich website which will enlighten you as well with a lot of updates with regards to our activities. Thank you so much, everyone. I leave you all. Have a great evening.